Let me begin with a quote. Quote, every Hebrew and every circumcised servant and proselyte was required to pay the temple shekel. After purchasing the sacrificial animals for all the feasts, new moons, and Sabbaths, there was still money left over for civil necessities such as wall and road repair. In plain words, the people were agreeing to be taxed to provide for the temple's needs. End quote. Exodus chapter 30, verse 13 states that this they shall give every one that passeth among them that are numbered half a shekel after the shekel of the sanctuary. End quote. Folks, the tax mentioned in the book of Exodus, according to most commentaries, was not a yearly tax, but the one in Nehemiah was. Though the exact value will vary depending on the source you read, the key to remember is it was about 1 to 2 days of daily wages. The average daily wage in the New Testament times was a Roman coin, Matthew chapter 20, verse 2. That would equal a third of a shekel according to some, while others would say it's a half of a shekel. That was 2 days' wages. Whatever the true value was, Nehemiah was requiring between 1 to 2 days' worth of wages for the upkeep of the temple annually. There was only one building to upkeep, and with over 1 million men, that is a lot of money available to take care of the temple. The point is not to think that those that tithe did not have to give in offerings, but those that did tithe also gave in offerings in addition to tithes. Today, most churches may have less than 100 members and not 1 million members to support the needs of a local church. Thus, this concept of the temple tax should be taught not as something mandated, for there's no central temple that all Christians go to today, but to help one see that the house of God should be supported, and it is not cheap. Dr. Kelly's main focus in his book is to disprove tithing. It focuses on giving to the poor, but neglects the support of the gospel workers and the upkeep of the house of God. Though he claims otherwise, as I have read his book over and over, this is my conclusion to the matter. The temple tax was required as the same amount whether one was rich or poor, for it was considered the redemption of the soul. Now, I'm not saying there should be a temple tax for each church today, but the principle is this tax being used for the upkeep of the temple should be taught in order for people to properly support their local house of worship. So now, here is what this chapter is all about. Again, we see that when there was true repentance from the children of Israel, there was a restoration of the tithe. In this chapter, Nehemiah, who was the governor, basically restored the order of the Levites and priests. Though Dr. Kelly stresses that the Levites and the priests minister about twice a year, it is not that way today. The calling of God is no longer based on what tribe you are from or ministering a few times a year, but that we fulfill the purpose to which we were created for. The key for today is the burden for the lost and make disciples of all nations, which was not part of the Levitical priesthood. In fact, the Apostle Paul was considered to be one of the greatest apostles of the New Testament, and yet he was not even from the tribe of Levi. That is why tithing is not meant to be the same as in the Old Testament. For in the Old Testament, only those from the tribe of Levi served at the altar. Dr. Kelly believes that Nehemiah gives us the context of Malachi. Yet Dr. Kelly himself is not clear on the context of Malachi. He will present a couple of different contexts to Malachi, but the question is, which one does he believe? Maybe it's a combination of both. That is what is so hard about his book. Once you think he believes one thing, he states another. Remember, the order of giving is the people brought, the Levites gave, the priest received the best. What happened to the remaining tithes given to the Levites after the tenth was given to the priest is the issue. They are stored somewhere, but as we read on in Nehemiah, it appears that not the entire remaining tithe for the Levites remained in the Levitical cities. Dr. Kelly is all over the place on this. In fact, I will show how his position changes like the wind. Remember, it's not just chapter 10 that tithes are mentioned. They are mentioned a total of 7 times in the book of Nehemiah, according to Dr. Kelly. So let's begin in chapter 10, verse 37. It states, "We will store the produce in the storerooms of the temple of our God. We will bring the best of our flour and other grain offerings, the best of our fruit, and the best of our new wine and olive oil." So folks, so far it's only the offerings of the people, and the tithes are not mentioned until the second half of the verse, which says, "And we promise to bring to the Levites 1/10 of everything our land produces, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all our rural towns." So Nehemiah 10:37 says, "For they, the Levites, collect our tithes," in the Amplified, and in the RSV, "for it's the Levites who collect the tithes also." So Nehemiah 10:37, the Levites collect the tithes where the people were living. Thus, the Levites should now have 90% of the tithe remaining with them in the Levitical cities after the priests got their share. But Dr. Kelly has assumed that Nehemiah 10:13 is speaking of where most of the Levites' share was automatically left in the Levitical cities. Since the Levites collected the tithe in various cities, then they should have stayed in the Levitical cities. Keep in mind that the tithe was modified by the king, and Dr. Kelly agrees with that as he stated in chapter 10. Dr. Kelly believes that Nehemiah chapter 10 seals the deal, and the bulk of the tithes were to be stored in the Levitical cities. Man, why am I going on with this? Hang in there. Yet Hezekiah had them brought to the temple. I believe the point in both Nehemiah chapter 10 and Hezekiah account found in 2 Chronicles chapter 31 speaks of the restoration of the tithe. For even if one brought all the tithes to the temple while the other one kept them in the Levitical cities, well, so what? Yet in either case, the fact that the tithes follow the order of giving, to me, that is the point of the text. But let's look at verse 38. It says, "A priest, a descendant of Aaron, will be with the Levites as they receive the tithes, and 1/10 of all that is collected as tithes will be delivered by the Levites to the temple of our God and placed in the storerooms." To me, this is clear as day. Notice, 1/10 of all that is collected as tithes will be delivered by the Levites to the temple of God and placed in the storerooms. I can't stress this enough that the command was to take 10% from the entire tithe, bring it to the temple. Let's just say, for argument's sake, there were 100 bags of wheat as the total tithe that was brought to the Levites. That would mean 10, not 8, not 5, not 11 bags of wheat would be the priest's share. The entire priest's share should be 10 in this example. It would be brought to the temple with the priest supervising, and now the Levites would have 90% of the tithe, and the priest would have 10%, which would all that the priest would get. That means the Levites have 90 bags. Check this out. If you think I'm going overboard with this, wait until you hear some more quotes from Dr. Kelly. Dr. Kelly states, quote, "And Nehemiah 10:38 is correct when it says that the priests received their 10th of the tithe from the Levites, not in Jerusalem, but in the city suburbs. And the priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites take tithes." Finally, Nehemiah 10:38 correctly points out that the Levites with the priests brought portions of the tithes to the temple for the priest and Levites who were daily serving. "And the Levites shall bring up the 10th of the tithe unto the house of our God, to the chamber into the treasure house." This is the context of Malachi 3:10. Folks, did you get that? Though the text clearly states that the entire priest's share would be brought to the temple, we just went through that. Dr. Kelly changes the very meaning of the text. Again, Nehemiah 10:37 talks about bringing the best of everything. But in verse 38, "And the priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites receive the tithes, and the Levites shall bring up the tithe of the tithes to the house of our God, to the chambers of the storehouse." And I'm quoting Dr. Kelly again. Finally, Nehemiah 10:38 correctly points out that the Levites with the priests brought portions of the tithes to the temple for the priest and Levites who were daily servant. That's not what the text says. For the Levites, once they brought up the entire priest share to the temple, then there's no more priest share to bring up, unless the priest got an additional daily share on top of what they already got. So once the tithes for the priests were separated by the Levites, none of the priest's portion should remain in the Levitical cities, but all the priest's tithe would go to the temple. And you're probably saying, why are you making such a big deal? You'll see. Hang in there. Thus, the best of the tithe went to the storehouse. Now, Dr. Kelly believes the priest's total share is now the daily portions of not only the priests, but that of the Levites. The priests were the Old Testament ministers, and since all the tithes for the priests went to the temple, then the temple should be considered the storehouse that Christians speak of according to this text. So let's look at Nehemiah 12:44. On that day, men were appointed to be in charge of the storerooms for the offerings, the first part of the harvest, and the tithes. They were responsible to collect from the fields outside the towns the portions required by the law for the priests and Levites. For all the people of Judah took joy in the priests and the Levites and their work. And then in verse 47, so now in the days of Zerubbabel and of Nehemiah, all Israel brought a daily supply of food for the singers, the gatekeepers, and Levites. The Levites in turn gave a portion of what they received to the priests, the descendants of Aaron. That's Nehemiah 12:47. Quote, as we shall also see in the following text, a small portion of the Levites' tithe was brought up from their cities and used day by day to feed the singers who were on duty during their weekly course rotation. End quote. So in review, all of Israel brought a daily portion to the Levites, who in turn gave portions to the priests. Dr. Kelly does point out that this passage is referring back to Hezekiah, where the people are bringing the tithes to the temple on a daily basis. But there's a modification. Even though the priests have all of their tithes according to the law of Moses, they still got a daily portion brought to the temple for not just the Levites, but for the priests. Now check out Dr. Kelly's new math. Quote, since therefore Malachi 3:10 does not refer to 90% or more bulk of the tithe which stayed in the Levitical cities for the Levites. End quote. How can it be more than 90% if 10% already went to the temple for the priests? Here's another quote. Quote, however, since the Levites' tithe was never brought to the storehouse, end quote. Yet Dr. Kelly contradicts himself again. Quote, finally, Nehemiah 10:38 correctly points out the Levites with the priests brought portions of the tithes to the temple for the priests and Levites who were daily serving. End quote. Next, if all the priest's portion went to the temple, then why does Dr. Kelly keep talking about the tithe left in the Levitical cities for the priests that are not currently ministering? Next, Dr. Kelly tries to clarify his position. Quote, this text is clear. The only portion of the tithe necessary for the temple was just enough to feed the priests and the Levites for their particular week. Even the wives, daughters, and young males of these would eat of the tithes from their cities. It was very likely that even this exception to the law commanded by Hezekiah had been corrected under Nehemiah, and each priest and Levite brought his own portion of the tithe from the cities as he went to serve. End quote. Again, if all the priest's portion brought to the temple, then what in the world is Dr. Kelly talking about? Quote, the only portion of the tithe necessary for the temple was just enough to feed the priests and Levites for their particular week. End quote. When the text states, Nehemiah 10:38, and the priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites receive the tithes, and the Levites shall bring up the tithe of the tithes to the house of our God, to the chambers of the storehouse. Now, up to this point, if all the entire priest tithe went to the temple, then how did the families get fed? That's probably what you're thinking. Once all the tithes of the priests went to the temple, then they could distribute it as needed, as they did it in the time of Hezekiah. The text commanded that the Levites bring up the full share of the tithe to the temple. And here is why this whole matter is so important. Because all offerings were to be brought to the temple, and the priest's tithe was considered a heave offering according to the law which we had previously discussed in chapter 4. I want you to think about how big this small portion that Dr. Kelly keeps talking about. If all the priest's tithes were brought to the temple, then why can't Dr. Kelly see that in our day as the entire minister's tithes are brought to the church? Just a reminder, I did mention that in the last chapter concerning the amount of those who would minister at the temple at any given time. The small portion that Dr. Kelly keeps talking about is not as small as he makes it out to be. Remember, if 24,000 are split up into 24 courses or groups, then that would be about 1,000 available to minister at the temple at any given time. I just wanted to let you know it is more than what it seems that Dr. Kelly is implying. I don't have a problem either way if after the priest got an additional portion to what they got. That doesn't bother me. The point is the priests already got their share from the Levites, and any additional portions would make more than 10% of the tithe. And remember, the priest's portion was considered a heave offering. And because of that, that's why all the priest's portion went to the temple, because it wasn't technically considered a tithe, even though it was. It became a heave offering. Now, in chapter 13 is where I believe the context of Malachi comes in. The governor Nehemiah was away at the time. There was a problem with the Levites, singers, and the gatekeepers. They didn't get their portions. Apparently, a priest had allowed a non-believer to actually have one of the storerooms houses for his use. Now, when Nehemiah found out, he cleared the house. He restored the rightful portions. Now, though it may have been the priest that stole the tithes, yet it also may have been the unbeliever who took them. The text really doesn't state. Either way, Nehemiah in this chapter modified his position and then had the tithes to be stored in the storehouses at the temple. So that would seem to be where the tithes would be stored, as we see later on in where? The book of Malachi. So Nehemiah chapter 13 verses 12 and 13. Then all Judah brought the tithes of grain, the new wine, and the oil to the storerooms. Verse 13, I sent treasurers over the storerooms. So again, people are bringing the tithe to the temple, which is the storehouse. Remember, according to Dr. Kelly, this was wrong with Hezekiah, but for some reason, Nehemiah is getting a free pass. Now, Dr. Kelly might say, whoa, wait a minute. It's because the priest stole from the temple the daily portions that they needed to replenish the supply that was stolen. Well, why not just have the Levites get more from the Levitical cities and bring them up? Wasn't it the job of the Levites to bring up the tithe from the Levitical cities, and you can have the priest supervising to the temple and not the people? If the priest stole the portions of the Levites and the singers at the temple, then have you ever even considered that they would do the same in the Levitical cities? Think about it. If they were so low to steal from God's house, then surely they would consider stealing from the Levitical cities. Thus, according to Nehemiah chapter 13, the temple again became a big distribution center. There was a priest, a scribe, and Levi, and a few other men that oversee the matter, so the portions that the Levites and the singers would not be neglected, as to what happened earlier. What I know is that even though the Levites brought all the portion of the priests to the house of God, here all Judah brought all the tithe to the temple, and thus there is a modification. Dr. Kelly may call this an exception because of the stolen tithes, but this is the second time that people brought the tithes directly to the temple. To me, not only Hezekiah, but also with Nehemiah, we can see the stage being set for Malachi 3:10. However, the book of Malachi deals with the issue that the tithes were not brought to the storehouse. Yet Dr. Kelly claims the priests were fully to blame. Now notice Dr. Kelly is all over the place on this matter. Remember, Nehemiah said this, 13:10, I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them. So the Levites and the singers who did work had fled to each his field. And in verse 12, then all Judah brought the tithes of grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. Yet then Dr. Kelly actually says that this is the context of Malachi. Quote, although the timing and exact details will follow, this verse demands that Malachi 3:10 should be understood as only a command to the dishonest priests to bring of all of the necessary priest portion of the tenth of the tithe into the storehouse. This doesn't make any sense, nor is it scriptural. In this chapter, it was the Levites and singers' portion that was neglected. Now, Dr. Kelly states, quote, the dishonest priests were to bring of all the necessary priest portion into the storehouse. Talk about confusion. Oh, but we're not done yet. So Dr. Kelly says this in the context of Malachi. Quote, Nehemiah noticed that the daily portions of the tithes which had been stored to feed the ministering Levites were missing. Notice he did not say that the priest portions were missing. Strange indeed, having nothing to eat, the Levites had returned to their fields. Again, the priests had stolen the portion of the tithe which belonged to the Levites. Therefore, the Levites went back home and resumed farming and herding like they did the rest of the year. So the context is the priest stole the Levites' portion in the above quote, but in the next quote, the dishonest priest stole from the priest's portion. Quote, although the timing and exact details will follow, this verse demands that Malachi 3:10 should be understood as only a command to the dishonest priest to bring all of the necessary priest portion of the tenth of the tithe into the storehouse. Man, which one is it? Page 83 or page 86? I don't know. Depends on what day it is, probably. So, as we go to the book of Malachi, keep this in mind. If the same thing happened in the book of Malachi, where Dr. Kelly claims that the priest stole the Levites' portions, page 86, or the priest stole the priest portions, page 83, at the temple, then consider this. If the Levites said, heck with this, went back to their farmlands, then at some point the priests would no longer have any tithe. Right? I mean, the job of the Levites was to collect the whole tithe, as Dr. Kelly states. If they stopped giving the priests their portion, then the priests would not have any tithe left. I would also think that the people could stop bringing their offerings to the priests. That would also hurt the priests and not the Levites, since the Levites got only the tithes and none of the offerings. Now, what might have happened is this. This is my reason why I believe all the tithes were to be brought to the temple. So hear me out. I believe this is important. After Nehemiah realizes that the portions of the Levites and singers were stolen at the storehouse, I believe he decided to have the people bring the tithes to the storehouse in order that trusted men would guard the tithe from being taken again. At least now, Nehemiah would have a procedure in place so this would not happen again. Thus, when we go to Malachi, it would then make sense that all the tithe was to be brought to the temple, since there would be measures in place to guard the tithes. To me, to bring all the tithes to the temple was probably a safety measure. After all, if left in the Levitical cities, we have no scripture that speaks of that tithe being guarded. As I said earlier, if they were so low to steal from the temple, then I think they would have no problem stealing from the Levitical cities. The last point to think about is this. Dr. Kelly does admit that a small amount of the Levites' tithe went to the temple to take care of those currently ministering. He also states there were some that were there permanently. Quote, only their leaders and special workers permanently lived in Jerusalem. End quote. Even if not all the tithe was stored at the temple, doesn't mean that the temple is not a storehouse. A storehouse stores something, and the temple did store all the tithes of the priests and some of the tithes of the Levites. So far, even if some of the tithe were stored in the Levitical cities in both Hezekiah and Nehemiah's accounts, the people did bring tithes directly to the temple by both. And the only one that seems upset is Dr. Kelly. With that in mind, let's go to the book of Malachi.